G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today we're going to be having a look at some of the new features in Dynamo with Revit 2022. It's just come out recently, and with it ships Dynamo 2.1 or 2.10 in this case. So there's a lot of new nodes that they've actually taken ideas from other custom developers, some really useful features that are really going to help people just coming out of the box without needing to be in custom packages. But as well as this, there's going to be some general interface changes, some things that you might not have seen if you weren't up to date on some of the very late builds of Dynamo for Revit 2021. So in this case, my goal is to really show you these and also just quickly show you some of the new API methods we have access to, in particular in relation to creating sketches of floor and ceiling outlines, for example. But I'm really excited for this. I can really see that Dynamo is getting quite polished now. It's really great to see some much needed workflows captured in the nodes that have been added. And hopefully this will better help you be encouraged to upgrade to this version so you can also take advantage of these features as well. Anyway, I'll be using Revit 2022, of course, and Dynamo 2.1. I'm sure there'll be new builds of Dynamo in future that will be released with successive builds of Revit 2022. But without further ado, let's jump in and have a look at it. One of the first things I must say I noticed when I first opened Dynamo is the graphics are a lot cleaner in the preview space. You might even be able to see right now that on the left I have Dynamo in Revit 2021, and on the right I have the graphics as shown in Revit 2022. Now I must say it looks like it's almost like, you know, in Revit when you turn on the clean graphic line style, everything is much cleaner as you zoom in and out. You will notice that the lines retain more crispness, and I must say this is a much more pleasant thing to look at than the previous lines in Dynamo, and I've noticed also the geometry tends to look a little bit crisper as well as a result. So a really nice improvement that's going to really help our eyes when we're working in Dynamo. But let's begin with the most obvious things first. What new nodes are here in Dynamo? What new functions do we have available? Well, I'm going to go through some of the smaller changes I noticed first. So in the Geometry tab, I did notice that we do have one new option for generating a solid, in this case using a ruled loft. So this seems to be new. In this case, here it is, by ruled loft. So I couldn't see this in the previous version of Dynamo. It looks like a more flexible way to generate a loft between two surfaces without the need for a guide curve or rail, and I think that's definitely going to be a useful method. It is an interesting method. I do have to experiment with it to really understand how it works. I am quite interested by the check and repair function, given that most of the time geometry in Dynamo tends to break and not repair itself if it's genuinely breaking. So I'll have to have a look at how this works a little bit later on. But it does seem to be a high performance way of generating loft forms compared to our previous options. I did notice under the data tab, a really small one, but a nice one. If we go to import export data, I did notice that the parse and stringified JSON files did have new logos, which is always nice. There are a few new logos here and there replacing the old generic Dynamo logo, but this was one that I did notice as I was going through. In terms of many of the inputs here, there's not too many new things before we get to Revit itself, but under list in inspect, we now also have the Anyfalse and Anytrue nodes built in. I believe the last time I saw these, they were in Clockwork, and I think also Orchid had these as well. So now we've got this function built into Dynamo, which is great. Quite a useful node that I use quite a lot. Under Organize, one thing that I really liked is that every time we have things that involve randomization now in Dynamo, they've introduced the option to cycle the seed that drives that aspect of randomization. A lot of functions didn't previously have this, which meant we were always just dealing with one predictable seed, and sometimes you might need to combine a certain degree of shuffling in order to achieve the effect of a seed. So I must commend the team on adding this. I'm sure it wasn't a difficult thing to add, but definitely a nice quality of life improvement. And while we're talking about randomization under math, in this case under, I believe, functions, we do have some random functions here as well, which have also been given options with and without seeds. I don't really understand why they kept the ones without seeds, because having a randomization function without a seed doesn't really make sense because it's on a fixed seed, I assume, unless there's some way that it's randomizing its seed as well based on a web request or something more creative than what I'm aware of. But it is nice to have this function added as well. I noticed there was one new node under string as well, before we get to the big ones. This one was the ToTitle node.
which will take a string and essentially uppercase the first letter of each word. So if I create a code block and say this is my string, and I feed this through the ToTitle, you can see that every first letter of each word is now capitalized and all other capital letters are retained as well. This can be useful sometimes when you're enforcing naming on two sets of strings for a file, for example. Let's say you're trying to construct a camel case, because from there we could do a string remove. Not a string remove actually, so we'd have to split it every time we come across a space, and then we could replace. We could also do a find replace actually. We could just do string replace. And we can just search in this case for space and replace with nothing. And that would essentially allow us to build like a little camel case fragment instead. So that's a nice little function to have. But I guess now let's get to the really big changes. In this case, if we go to Revit, I've noticed a lot of changes have snuck in here. Some of them I haven't had time to play with yet, but they're things that people might know more about if I don't. One thing I don't necessarily understand because I haven't used them before is I've noticed in the Analyze tab, there's a new tool called a label by point and string. So I assume this relates to the actual markers in an analysis study in Revit. I don't use these very often, I will be honest, but maybe this is potentially a tool that some people might find useful in setting up their graphics. As most people know, I tend to use Grasshopper for most of my analysis-based studies, using Rhino inside when I have to, so it might be useful for some people still. But as well as this, I did notice under application, now this was in the previous version of Revit, so if I do go to Revit 2021, Revit application warning, this was also here, and these warnings were essentially absorbed from the Bang package by John Pearson. But if you were using an earlier build of Revit, I don't believe this was in Revit 2020, so it's really worth being aware of this set of nodes. I just wanted to point them out because I know a lot of you probably skipped Revit 2021 to come to Revit 2022. We tend to leapfrog a package here and there. As well as this, there's a lot of new nodes under elements, so I might just open up this one just to compare. First of all, in this case, if I go to dimension, I know they've added a lot of new methods for interacting with dimensions. So you can see here that we have a lot of ways to create dimensions by element direction, by edges, in this case by faces. So they're adding more options. Now we also have by references, which is great. This is pretty much the way that we usually would be constructing a dimension. They're also incorporating suffix and prefix additions as well, which weren't usually present in many of the creation methods. The thing that they really need to add now to round out the dimensioning tools is from the Genius Loci package and a few others, where you can extract dimensions by their name and get those references from an element. So for example, taking the center lines of a column family based on inputting the name center, front, back, and retrieving that reference, which will then let you create that dimension by references. That's really the last missing thing that is really needed to round out this set of tools. If we go to element as well, I think in this case, there should be some tools under elements that might be new. So in this case, I did notice at the very least that one thing that is probably new to some people if they haven't used Revit 2021 is we do have a lot of methods for joining and unjoining elements now. I think these weren't in Revit 2020, so they're definitely worth being aware of because I get a lot of requests about joining and unjoining elements using Dynamo, and whilst we could do it through the API before, now we have native nodes available which can do this for us. I don't believe there was too many other nodes in here. There's a couple, like there's some things to do with view overrides, which is quite handy because often we're trying to find the elements that have specific view overrides. So we could filter these elements based on the overrides that they have. We would have to deconstruct the override graphic settings, but it's still a very useful function to have when we're doing documentation cleanup. So after elements, we then also had, I believe, what was the next one? We did have floors, but in this case, floors are a little bit of a unique one. Even though the methods are the same here, we actually have a new API method available to us, which will allow us to cut holes in floors. Even though we haven't also got the ceiling tool here yet, we also have a method available to create ceilings, which couldn't actually be passed through the API previously, that has now been incorporated. And we also have the ability to put holes in sketches of elements like walls. So for example, I will show you how the floor creation API works now. I will just go and create, I'll open a new script. So in this case, I should have a testing script. I'll just navigate to it. So I've built a script that has a little Python node in it, and essentially I'm getting a ceiling type, I'm collecting a set of curves, so I'm firstly getting an outline for my floor, then I'm getting a hole in the middle. So you are going to have to find ways to break these into sets of curves, because we're going to be creating elements called curve loops. I'm going to make a separate video talking about how you can run this API, but for now I'm just going to show you what it does. So I'm just going to create a border and set these elements, and then I'm also just going to create a donut in the middle, and this will be the hole in my floor. And we couldn't previously do floors with holes, so this is great. So inside this first script, I'm essentially deconstructing these curves into lists and converting them into Revit objects, and then creating curve loops out of those sets. And then joining these curve loops into a list, and then feeding these through the floor.create function, or sorry, method now, which we can use to create that floor. So if I run this, I might need to run my script first. We can see that we've created a floor that also has a hole in the middle, which might seem small to some people, but is really big when you're trying to automate things like floor finishes in rooms that aren't necessarily just an enclosed space with no holes in the middle. Likewise, ceilings, I created the ceiling using almost the same method, but just using ceiling.create instead. And you can see in this case that the ceiling also supports the ability to put sketch holes in the middle as well. So this is a really welcome change that we have been waiting for a long time. I'm very happy to see this added. It will help us quite a lot. So whilst we're moving through elements, I believe there's a parameter group in here as well. Now I think that these nodes might be here in Revit 2021 as well. Yes, they are, but I just wanted to make people aware of them because I do get a lot of requests about them, and I don't believe they were all in Revit 2020. In this case, a lot of them give you the ability to create project and shared parameters as new elements. You can also do things like obtain the path to the shared parameter file, and also apply parameters and shared parameters to categories in the model as a project parameter. So these are really handy functions. I get requested a lot. There are a lot of custom packages that do it as well, and I see a lot of people use them when really the tools to do it are actually just here in Dynamo already. And as well as this, it's important to note this is just for projects. So if you're adding family parameters, there is a node inside here that can add a parameter to a family by name, but not one for shared parameters. For this, I tend to use the Orchid package instead. So definitely keep that in mind. We also have some new things for ScheduleOnSheet. So this category didn't actually exist before in the node browser, and this gives you the ability in this case to specify schedules onto sheets, which is quite useful. The method we used to use before was a little bit different in order to do this, so it's a really welcome feature for something that people have probably been trying to do for a long time. It could be a really useful method for copying schedules across multiple sheet sets at the same time. And also you can do things like update the location of schedules, interrogate the location. In this case, we can check the schedule for the schedule instance, so which schedule is the schedule on the sheet actually associated to back in the view browser, and also what sheet it appears on as well. So that's a really welcome set of nodes that will simplify some processes that we were already doing for this. We also have some functionalities added to the tag nodes. So now we have the ability to deal with leaders and heads and position tags more precisely. There are a lot of nodes already in the Rhythm package that focused on these things, but it is welcome to have these available in Dynamo by default from now on. So I'll definitely be taking advantage of a lot of those. The Viewport class is very, very interesting. I think there's some great new nodes here. If I go to views, I think maybe, yeah, it appears it wasn't even really available before. So I think under, yeah, it's actually, they've changed the structure of all of this actually, from what I can tell. So under views, viewport, yeah, we've got completely different sections that deal with these now. Cool. So where was I? Element viewport. Okay, element viewport, and I'm also under elements viewport. So previously, the only thing we were able to do was create a viewport based on a sheet and a location. Whilst we do still have this node and it's got a nice spiffy new icon, we also have the ability to retrieve the center of viewports on sheets and also set the location of viewports on sheets as well. So this is really handy when you're trying to match locations of floor plans on multiple sheets. We also have the ability to obtain the outlines of viewports as well, which can be really handy when we're trying to evenly space viewports on a sheet. You'll need to know the size of the viewports in order to do that. And we can also interrogate the view that belongs to the viewport and the sheet that the viewport sits on. Some really handy things that a lot of custom packages could already do, but really nice to have them inside as well. I think as well as this, there was another set of nodes called GeometryReferences, which in this case we didn't have before. We did have a set of nodes called references, and I must note that the references section seems to have disappeared in Dynamo for Revit 2022, so I'm not sure if the developers did that on purpose. This previously just had a node for creating array bounce. I'm not quite sure if maybe they got rid of it because it was redundant or didn't work. I haven't used that node before, to be honest. I usually use the bimorph nodes package for array bouncing. But in this case, there is an option to add an element or face curve reference based on elements. So I assume in this case, this is really part of supporting the workflow to enable the creation of dimensions, I assume, given that they're calling them references. I assume what you get out of this at the end is an element face reference. So I'm not quite sure if that's to support dimensions. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to use them for, but I'm sure there must be some uses for them. If we keep going through, I believe we also have some new nodes. I think on the schedules are the same. I'm just looking through my list because I've made a big list of all the things to take note of. So if we go to views, we've got a great new set of nodes that deal pretty much entirely with sheets. This was a really exciting section, a lot of new updates in this area. So we can see in this case that not only do we have a lot of new nice icons, but we also have a lot of sheet creation methods. So for example, we now have the option to place views onto sheets at the same time as the sheet creation process, both by view and location, and views and locations. So if you're creating sheets and views as part of one script, you no longer need to stage them in a various sequence. These nodes can do that for you. So quite a handy way to sort of condense and simplify some workflows potentially. You can also modify the property of sheets as well, which is a much more direct method than the previous one of having to use set parameter by name. It does seem a little bit pointless, given that we could have just used by parameter and name, but it's an interesting thing to add, I guess, just to make some very common things more accessible to basic users. We can also retrieve all the viewports off the sheet, which is brilliant. This was definitely a much needed thing. Some custom packages could do this already, but it's still nice to have. And we can also extract the title block or title blocks off of a sheet, which is quite a hard element to access. I have seen the Rhythm package manage to do this successfully with a drop-down for title block types, but at the same time, it is nice to have this option provided to us just to extract the title block off a sheet. We can also get the schedules, but one of the most interesting nodes to me was the DuplicateSheet tool. So in this case, we give it a sheet and we can give options for how we want to duplicate the views. So with detailing as dependent, and as well as this, then we have the option to prefix and suffix. I assume this is to prefix and suffix the views in this case. It looks like that's probably the case. So in this case, it's copy, if not. So that's a really great function. I know a lot of people built some fairly complex scripts just to do this. So I guess it sucks to be them, but at the same time, it's great to have that function built in by default now and much more straightforward than before, because duplicating sheets is a very common task we typically need to do. So I think that'll get a lot of people to Dynamo faster, that we're doing a lot of this. If we go to view, we also have a lot of new nodes under view. So in this case, these are great because views and sheets are a really big part of automation workflows in Revit and Dynamo. So I'm really glad they focused on these, but we have a heap of things we can do now. So we have the option to duplicate views, which is brilliant. I haven't found where the view duplicate option is. There we go. So we have the option for how we want to duplicate views as well. So I think in this case, these nodes used to be present, or probably still are present in the Archilab package. I think this is where they started from, but it's good to see them finally find a home in Dynamo, given how useful they are. We also have a lot of category and element override options that we didn't have before. Another really exciting thing is we have the ability to retrieve and modify the crop box of views. Really helpful when you're doing things like setting up cropped floor plans and cropped elevations. I think the only package I knew that could do this before was either Rhythm or MEP Over. I used to use MEP Over. From Revit 2022, it's going to be very welcome to have these built in by default. And we have some interesting other nodes as well, things that retrieve view disciplines, display styles, outlines. There's a lot of things that have been added to views now. So I do commend the development team for the effort they definitely put into this area of Dynamo as well. Really handy. So I think that's pretty much most of the new nodes that have been added. But as well as this, there's definitely some things to be aware of in how Dynamo functions now. One thing that's quite small but quite nice is if you go to View and you go to Show Documentation Browser, and also then you load in, say, the workspace references, now the tabs stack vertically, which is quite nice. Before they got a bit small when they stack together, and you can also break these out as maximized windows as well that you can dock outside Dynamo, which is quite useful. It's worth noting as well that you can now see the package and the version of things. So if I create a custom node from my package and I refresh, I can now see which version this package is as well. But if I go in this case, I believe to show this before, I think it didn't show the version. Oh, actually it is now, never mind. I thought that for some reason wasn't showing up before, but it seems to be there now. Never mind. Well, I guess it's just dockable windows is probably the main thing to be aware of instead. But I know in one of the versions you couldn't always see the version on that, I believe, or it was shown in a different way. But in this case we can see it, so ignore me on that one. One thing I do really like is that the package manager feels faster as well. So if I go to search for a package, I did notice most of the time that the new version of Dynamo outpaced the old one, and sometimes this could take a very long time to connect. It was very subtle in this case, but it still beat it just by a little bit. But I've definitely noticed it's much faster opening the package manager and connecting to the server. I'm not sure why that would be, or maybe it's just related to my internet, but it does seem to be faster. Now, one feature that was being experimented on in Dynamo 2.7 that some people might have been aware of is if I just create a new document and I just get a all elements of category node, or just any old node, and I hold down the Alt key and I click, I'm going to get, in this case, some intelligent autocomplete options, which will try to tell me which nodes I should use. Now, I must say it's not always on the money. In this case, I would have wanted a categories dropdown or an element, category by name node. But in this case, instead, it's giving me some basic inputs. So it doesn't always get it right. If I get a category by name node instead, maybe. In this case, it knows that the input should be a string. So sometimes it is actually quite good. Other times, not necessarily. Let's create a circle by center point radius, because I know this example works quite well. So in this case, I can get a center point, I can get a radius, and it's a number slider. So you can see that it works quite well. Now, one thing I do definitely want to request of the development team is let's make this thing work in the other direction as well. At the moment, I don't believe it supports output formats. So if I hold down Alt, nothing's happening. It'd be great to see this work in both directions to really speed up putting a script together. Now, having said that, I know there's heaps of options for what this output could go towards, but I think some of them are sometimes quite obvious. For example, if you have a list of elements, you're probably sometimes going to want to do the get parameter value by name node, or maybe sometimes you're going to do the filter by Boolean mask node. There are still some very common forward paths that we use in this direction quite often. So I think that maybe this feature might be useful for some people. I don't know if I'm going to use it that much myself. But it is nice to know that it's there. If you do want to enable it, it's just under Settings, Experimental, and just enable Node Autocomplete. You're also going to notice while we're here, there's a few extra things related to the Python engine. So in this case, we can see there's a new default Python engine. Now, if you didn't use Dynamo 2.7 or beyond, you probably weren't aware that CPython is now actually available in Dynamo. So this is a much more modern version of Python than the IronPython 2 system that we used originally. They've managed to support both of them in Dynamo for now, but I do know that on their roadmap for Dynamo, they are looking to phase out IronPython. So they have added some tools to help with this. So in this case, first of all, if I maybe just take a custom node from my package, I haven't actually tried this, so hopefully it works. I'm just trying to find one that has a fair amount of things built into a Python node. I might find my views to sheets node by points. At the moment, this should be in IronPython. So if I edit this custom node and I just have a look at this Python script block, notice it says IronPython 2. So this isn't actually the case in older builds of Dynamo in Revit 2021 and prior, only in the experimental builds. If I right click on this, I can change the Python engine version as well. I can also learn more about Python, which is always nice, but let's just edit the node for now. Now, one thing that's really welcome in the case of how they've modified this is if I make a change to this and save, it no longer closes the Python node. This is a welcome change. It used to be really annoying when you're just trying to save your progress in a node that you don't just want to close that thing every time. In this case, I can actually move over from IronPython 2 to CPython, and there is going to be a migration assistant which will try to tell me what it should look like. It's going to find things that have potentially changed. So you can see in this case that some of the syntax has been changed just a little bit, not much, that it's taken out some white space. In this case, there's an indentation that it seems to have fixed. So I think it's fixing all my indentations, but otherwise it seems that there isn't really any other change required. So I'm about to make changes to my Python code, that's fine. Okay, the backup has been saved. And now I'm on CPython. So at this point, I should hopefully be able to see that this is working with CPython, and ideally should also now support that functionality as well. I can probably just really quickly check if this node actually works just by setting up the inputs for it. So in this case, I'm going to provide a point. I'm just going to get a sheets dropdown, and I'm going to get a views dropdown, and just pick any old view to put on any old sheet. In this case, I'm probably going to need to find one that isn't actually placed yet. That might be actually harder than I think. In this case, I'll just try to put the ground floor plan maybe. So what I'll do is I'll just navigate to my ground floor plan, remove this view, and I just want to see if I get any warnings from this about the new Python node. If not, then that's great. So I'm running it through CPython now instead. I'm not sure why it's taking longer than usual. Usually that will be a very quick process, but it worked. So in this case, we have successfully upgraded our Python script to the CPython system. In this case, very few changes required. I'm sure some scripts will actually have a lot more syntax that needs to be modified, but having a migration assistant is really a great hand to have with you. The last thing that I will point out too is I know a few of the DSCore design script calls are much easier to deal with now. So if you're trying to call on datetime, you can now just call on datetime. If I go, I think, into the previous build, and I just create a code block. See, it's datetimes and DSCore datetime. So it's actually, there's a little bit of ambiguity between some of those DS references from before. So now you can just leave out the DSCore, and it just has a hidden component of that reference instead that it handles for you. So that's a really welcome change. Some of those DSCore references were really annoying to call on before, so it's going to be a lot nicer to be able to start off a call without referencing DSCore. So just a nice little quality of life improvement. But I think for the most part, there's some really great new nodes in here, especially related to views and sheets, that are going to help us out a lot. And I can see a few signs of some extra sets of nodes incoming. For example, floor and ceiling creation, and potentially also maybe retrieving element references by name. Hint, hint, Dynamo developers, we really need that built in because it's such a common function we use for dimensioning. But otherwise, I must congratulate the team. I think it's a great release. I think there's been a good amount of work put into Dynamo as well as into Revit itself. And I look forward to seeing what comes in the future.
So there you go. As you can see, there's some really useful new features that have been added in Dynamo, some nodes that really help productivity and also just support general workflows in ways that we used to have use many custom packages in order to achieve. Having said that, there's still a lot of great custom packages out there that do very special things that I still recommend using. These include Clockwork, Rhythm, Springs, Genius Loci, Data Shapes, and Archilab, amongst a few others as well. So this doesn't necessarily mean you have to go and uninstall all your custom packages, and of course you're still going to have to go and replace a lot of those old custom nodes anyway, right? Anyway, I'll have a lot of other Dynamo tutorials coming up in future that will show some of these new features off in context, so I can teach you how to do things like create new floors before they update the Dynamo nodes, which currently don't support multiple holes in the floors, for example. So keep an eye out for those in the near future. If you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos and other Dynamo tutorials I produce. Anyway, thanks. Take care. Bye.